The president of the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association looked me dead in the eye, her lip curling with that specific kind of suburban disdain that smells like expensive Chardonnay and unearned authority, and told me, "Your grandfather's reservoir is stealing equity from my community," before slapping a $65,000 lien on the exact spot where I scattered my late wife's ashes. So, I did exactly what she asked. I stopped the theft, I pulled the plug, and I let nature wash her multi-million-dollar empire right off the side of the mountain. Right now, as I record this voiceover, I'm standing on the edge of what used to be Veronica Sterling's pristine, award-winning English garden, watching her try to wade through waist-deep sludge in a Chanel suit that probably costs more than my truck, screaming at a news crew while her brand-new Porsche Taycan floats past her mailbox like a very expensive rubber duck. The smell is something you can't really capture on camera. It's a thick, heavy cocktail of diesel fuel, destroyed landscaping, and raw sewage, the distinct scent of Mother Nature taking back what arrogant people thought they could tame with a checkbook. See that sodden, dissolving piece of red paper she's clutching like a lifeline? That's the final notice of seizure she filed against my cabin 48 hours ago, demanding 50 grand immediately, or else the sheriff comes to evict me from the land my family has held since the Kennedy administration. All because I refuse to drain the natural spring-fed basin that has been silently preventing this exact catastrophe for 60 years. Turns out, when you mess with a grieving widower's sacred ground just to boost your property value, physics doesn't give a damn about your HOA bylaws or your social standing. My name is Caleb Dozer Mitchell, a nickname I earned during 25 years designing levees and flood control grids for the Army Corps of Engineers, and at 52 years old, I thought I had seen every form of bureaucratic incompetence the government could manufacture, but I hadn't met Veronica Sterling yet. 2 years ago, after my wife Elena finally succumbed to the cancer that had been eating away at our happiness, I inherited my grandpa Silas's 3-acre homestead in Aspen Creek Heights, Montana. The property had been in the Mitchell bloodline since 1962, back when this area was nothing but elk trails and whisper-quiet pines, built by Silas's own calloused hands. He built the A-frame cabin, the heavy timber workshop, and most critically, the spring-fed catch basin where Elena and I used to sit for hours, watching the reflection of the clouds, and where I eventually let her ashes drift into the water on a freezing October morning that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. That pond wasn't just a pretty water feature for looks. Grandpa Silas understood hydrodynamics better than most PhDs I've worked with, channeling a natural aquifer into a retention system that acted as a brake pressure valve for the entire valley below. The sound of that water, trickling over the limestone rocks he stacked by hand, sounded exactly like Elena's breathing when she was asleep, soft, constant, essential. That sanctuary was violated the morning Veronica Sterling's electric sports car crunched up my gravel driveway, looking like a spaceship landing in the frontier. Picture a woman designed by a committee of corporate sharks, platinum blonde hair cut into a sharp geometric bob that could cut glass, a charcoal power suit, and the kind of predatory smile that says, "I'm going to ruin your life, and I'm going to write it off as a business expense." She stepped out into the mountain air, her stilettos sinking into the dirt, clutching a leather binder like a weapon. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, extending a hand that felt cold and lifeless, like shaking hands with a mannequin. "Veronica Sterling, president of the Aspen Creek Heights HOA. We have a catastrophic issue with your unauthorized water hoarding." I wrapped my hands tighter around my coffee mug, feeling the phantom weight of my wedding ring. "Excuse me." She snapped the binder open. "This artificial lake violates the water management protocols we voted in 6 months ago, while you were away," and the way she said away, referencing the months I spent in the hospital by Elena's bedside, made my molars grind together loud enough to crack. "My grandfather built this in 1962, I said, trying to keep my engineer's voice steady. 60 years before your little club even existed." "Nevertheless," she interrupted, slapping a document onto my porch railing, "all water features must comply. You have 30 days to terraform this back to dry land." Here is where the plot thickens into pure evil, because while I was planning Elena's funeral, Veronica's husband, Councilman Arthur Sterling, a man who looks like he was 3D printed to be a corrupt politician, had quietly pushed through new regulations during a closed-door session. Every other property got a grandfather clause, literally everyone, except mine. Veronica wasn't a concerned neighbor. She was a vulture, a real estate mogul who specialized in harassing longtime residents until they sold cheap, and my 3 acres, with its elevation and water rights, was the linchpin she needed for her new luxury condo project, the Summit at Aspen Creek. I stood there as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the water in the same gold and crimson hues that Elena loved, and I could practically hear my wife's voice, clear as a bell, whispering, "Dozer, honey, you never run from a bully." She was right. I had spent a career outsmarting rivers and holding back tides, so it was high time I reminded these people that water, like justice, always finds the path of least resistance. 3 days after her ultimatum, she returned, but this time she brought the B team. A beat-up sedan followed her Porsche, and out stepped a skinny, terrified-looking kid in a polo shirt that was 2 sizes too big, holding a clipboard like a shield. "Mr. Mitchell, meet Julian Sterling, our certified hydrologist," Veronica announced, beaming like a proud shark mother. The kid couldn't have been older than 24, with shifty eyes and the kind of nervous sweat that usually implies guilt. "Certified by who?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "The University of Mommy and Daddy?" "The Montana Water Bureau," Julian squeaked, flashing a laminated ID that looked like it was printed on a home inkjet an hour ago. "Now, I've worked with federal inspectors from the Bayou to the Rockies. They drive government trucks, they wear steel-toed boots, and they don't share a last name with the complainant. Mind if I call the Bureau to verify that badge number?" I asked, pulling out my phone. The blood drained from Julian's face faster than a flush toilet. That's not necessary. This is just a preliminary visual assessment." What followed was an hour of absolute farce. Julian took photos of my pond from angles designed to make it look stagnant, scribbled notes that wouldn't pass a middle school science class, and measured the depth with a literal yardstick he probably bought at a hardware store that morning. Grandpa Silas's voice echoed in my head. "Boy, when a man in a cheap suit comes for your land, you check his pockets and you load the shotgun." "Your assessment?" Veronica asked, practically vibrating with anticipation. "Definitely unauthorized retention," Julian mumbled, avoiding my gaze. "Potential mosquito vector and, excessive accumulation beyond the community aesthetic guidelines." That's when Veronica played her ace, handing me a violation notice stamped in aggressive red ink. $5,000 fine for unauthorized theft of community water resources. Theft? I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. From a spring that was bubbling here before your husband was even born. "Individual desires cannot supersede the collective good," she recited, like a robot programmed to destroy happiness. The real gut punch came the next morning when my neighbor, Old Man Jenkins, shuffled over looking like he'd seen a ghost, handing me a copy of the Aspen Creek Gazette. Page 3, headline, "Local Hermit Hoards Water While Neighbors Face Restrictions." The article painted me as a deranged survivalist stealing water from families, featuring a photo of my pond taken with a filter that made it look like a swamp. Reading it felt like being kicked in the stomach. Elena would have wept to see our sanctuary dragged through the mud by people who wouldn't know integrity if it bit them. But Veronica had made a tactical error, one that would have gotten her flunked out of officer candidate school. She declared war on a man who had nothing left to lose but time. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse, a depressing brick building that smelled of floor wax and old lies, and I started digging. 3 hours of navigating microfiche later, I found the weapon I needed. Grandpa Silas's original deed from 1962 included perpetual spring and mineral rights, predating the HOA by decades. Every drop of water in that pond was legally, irrevocably mine. I called Atticus Rook Thorne, my old buddy from the Corps who traded his combat boots for a law degree. Rook laughed when I explained the situation, a deep, booming sound. "Dozer, perpetual water rights in Montana? That's not just a shield, that's a nuclear deterrent. They can't touch you." But then Rook dug deeper, and his tone changed. He found that Councilman Arthur Sterling was the silent partner in Summit Peak Ventures, a shell company buying up land around me. This wasn't just harassment, it was a siege. 2 weeks later, Veronica escalated from skirmishes to total psychological warfare. The community center was packed for the monthly board meeting, the air thick with the smell of stale donuts and nervous tension. And as I walked in, I noticed the room was filled with strangers, young professionals and athleisure wear who had just moved in, the kind of people who think milk comes from a carton, not a cow. Veronica had stacked the deck. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, projecting a slide onto the wall that showed my beautiful pond photoshopped into a neon green toxic waste dump. "We are facing a biological hazard. Independent testing confirms Mr. Mitchell's hoarding pit is a breeding ground for West Nile virus and E. coli." A gasp went through the room. Independent testing? I whispered to myself. I tested that water weekly. It was cleaner than the bottled garbage they drank. Mrs. Gable, a sweet old lady from down the lane, raised her hand. "But hasn't that pond been there forever?" "Age does not excuse danger," Veronica snapped, shutting her down. The board voted unanimously to triple my fine to $15,000 plus daily penalties. Then came the restraining order preventing me from maintenance on the pond due to health risks. I walked home under the moonlight, feeling the walls closing in, but combat engineering teaches you one thing. When the enemy mines the road, you find a new path. That night, I installed military-grade trail cameras all along my perimeter, hidden in the pines. It took exactly 48 hours to catch them. At 2:14 a.m., Julian Sterling crept onto my property, carrying a 5-gallon bucket. The infrared camera captured him dumping dead fish, rotten trout he probably bought at a market, into my crystal-clear water, then snapping photos. He was manufacturing the health crisis. Later that same night, Councilman Arthur showed up with a surveyor crew, trespassing on my land to map out where the foundation for their new condos would go. They were measuring drapes for a house they hadn't even bought yet. I convened a war council in my kitchen. Old Man Jenkins, his wife Martha, and a few other longtime residents like the Hendersons. "They're coming for all of us," I told them, laying out the photos of Julian poisoning my water. Old Man Jenkins slammed his fist on the table. "I got cited for my vegetable garden last week. Said it was agricultural blight. We got fined for our fence," Mrs. Henderson added. "The same fence that's been there since '85. It was a purge. They were systematically bankrupting the old guard to make way for the Summit Peak project. We formed the Creek Guardians right there, a resistance movement fueled by coffee and righteous indignation." But Veronica wasn't done. A lawsuit arrived, delivered by a process server with a smirk. They were suing me for endangering public welfare, supported by a report from a corrupt county health inspector named Inspector Barnett. Rook, my lawyer, did some digging. Barnett had received 3 large consulting fees from Summit Peak Ventures in the last 6 months. I needed heavy artillery. I called in a favor from Dr. Li Wei, a brilliant environmental scientist at the university who owed me for helping design her lab's filtration system. She arrived with equipment that looked like it belonged on a Mars rover. Her results? My water was pristine. "This is glacial melt quality," she said, sealing the vials. Inspector Barnett either never tested this, or he's lying. While Rook filed countersuits for fraud, conspiracy, and trespassing, citing the camera footage and Dr. Wei's report, the harassment turned physical. My electricity was cut accidentally. My dog, Buster, a German shepherd who usually loved everyone, started growling at the perimeter. I found Veronica's private security goons, Titan Protection, standing just over my property line, filming me with zoom lenses. They were trying to provoke a reaction, trying to make the crazy veteran snap. But the final key to their destruction was found in the basement of the Hall of Records. I was looking for water tables when I found the original 1980 Army Corps survey of the region. My heart stopped. My pond wasn't just private property. It was designated as a federal flood control node for the entire Elk River watershed. Interfering with it wasn't just an HOA violation, it was a federal felony. I called the Regional Army Corps office. "Major, this is Dozer. Yeah, I'm retired, but I've got a situation in Aspen Creek involving unauthorized tampering with federal infrastructure." The voice on the other end promised an investigation, but bureaucracies move slow, and Veronica moved fast. She managed to get an emergency court order from a judge who played golf with her husband. The order demanded the immediate drainage of the hazardous water feature. On a gray Tuesday in November, the sheriff arrived, looking apologetic, followed by Veronica's convoy of industrial pump trucks. "Mr. Mitchell," the deputy said, refusing to look me in the eye, "I have to enforce the order. You need to stand back." Veronica stood by her Tesla, arms crossed, gloating. She thought she had won. She thought she was taking away my memories of Elena, my grandfather's legacy, and my dignity. But she didn't look at the weather report. I did. A massive Pacific front was barreling toward the Rockies, predicted to drop 5 inches of rain in 24 hours starting that night. My pond was the only thing stopping that water from rushing down the valley and turning her neighborhood into a swimming pool. I looked at the pump trucks. I looked at the dark clouds gathering over the peaks. And I smiled. You want it drained? I shouted over the wind. Fine. You win, Veronica. Drain it all. I wasn't surrendering. I was loading the cannon. The pumps roared to life, a mechanical scream that drowned out the wind, sucking 60 years of history out of the earth and spitting it into the storm drains. Veronica Sterling stood there like a conquering queen, watching the water level drop, unaware that she was essentially cutting the brake lines on her own car while driving down a mountain. I stood back, recording everything on my phone. The flow rates, the pump operators, the smug look on Councilman Arthur's face as he arrived to watch the hazard disappear. By 6 p.m., the basin was a muddy scar. Empty. By 9 p.m., the rain started. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge, a biblical sheet of water that hammered the roof of my cabin like machine gun fire. I sat on my porch with Buster, sipping coffee, watching the hydrology reports on my laptop. Without the retention pond to catch the runoff from the upper ridge, the water was accelerating, picking up speed and debris, heading straight for the path of least resistance, Aspen Creek Heights. The emergency town hall meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. that night, a victory lap for Veronica to announce the cleanup was complete. I put on my best suit, grabbed a waterproof briefcase containing Dr. Way's report, the Army Corps charts, and the video of Julian dumping dead fish, and drove down the mountain. The community center was buzzing, but the mood had shifted. The rain was pounding against the windows, loud and angry. Veronica was at the podium, shouting to be heard over the storm. We have successfully mitigated the threat, she announced, gesturing to a photo of my empty pond. I walked to the front of the room. The doors blew open behind me with a gust of wind. Mitigated. I projected my voice, using that command tone I learned in the service. You didn't mitigate a threat, Veronica. You removed the shield. I plugged my laptop into the projector system, overriding her slide. The screen filled with the 1980 federal flood map. This, I pointed to the blue circle on the map, was the primary retention node for this entire valley. You drained it 3 hours before a 100-year storm. The lights flickered. Thunder shook the floorboards. This is fear-mongering. Councilman Arthur yelled, standing up. No, I said, clicking the remote to show the video of his son poisoning my water. This is evidence. Evidence of fraud, evidence of federal infrastructure tampering, and evidence of stupidity. The crowd gasped as they watched Julian on the big screen. Veronica's face went pale. And right now, I checked my watch. The water that should be sitting in my pond is currently bypassing the natural spillway and entering the municipal storm drains, which can handle about 20% of this volume. As if on cue, the back doors burst open again. It was Deputy Miller, soaking wet. We need to evacuate the lower streets. The drains have backed up. Sycamore Lane is under 3 feet of water. Sycamore Lane. That was where Veronica lived. My basement. Veronica shrieked, her composure shattering like cheap glass. Gravity always wins, I told her, unplugging my laptop. I tried to tell you. That pond wasn't hoarding water from the community. It was protecting the community from the water. We watched through the lobby windows as the streets turned into rivers. It was chaos, but it was clarifying chaos. Veronica's precious white Tesla, the symbol of her arrogance, bobbed past the community center, scraping against a submerged fire hydrant. Then came the Blue Jackets. Not the police, the FBI, flanked by military police from the Army Corps. They had arrived just in time to see the disaster unfold. They walked right past me and approached Councilman Arthur and Veronica. Federal warrant. The lead agent barked over the thunder. Conspiracy, wire fraud, and destruction of protected wetlands. The handcuffs clicked. It was the sweetest sound I'd heard since the water in my pond. In the aftermath, the truth came out like the sun after the storm. Summit Peak Ventures collapsed. Veronica was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Arthur got 3 years for the corruption. Julian rolled on his parents for a plea deal. But the real victory wasn't the prison sentences, It was the neighborhood. The flood damage was severe, but it woke everyone up. The new residents and the old residents stopped fighting. We worked together to pump out basements, rip out wet drywall, and rebuild. 6 months later, the Army Corps helped me restore the pond, bigger and better than before, officially designating it the Elena Mitchell Memorial Wildlife Preserve. I still sit out there in the evenings with Buster, listening to the water trickle over the stones. It's peaceful again. The scar on the land has healed, covered in wildflowers. Justice is a lot like water, I suppose. You can try to dam it up, you can try to redirect it, but eventually, the pressure builds, the walls break, and it flows exactly where it's meant to go. But it leaves me wondering, and I want to ask you this. I knew what would happen when I let them drain that pond. I let their homes flood to prove a point and expose the corruption. Was that justice? Or was I just as ruthless as they were? Let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the trenches of suburbia. Stay dry out there.